Hello there. I'm John Korstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, Virginia. And so this is part of my series, Civil War lecture series that I used to do in the museum. But in these days, we've got the great technology to reach out to people via the Zoom format. And today I'm going to talk about a very important story that is often overlooked, and that is the capture of Port Royal Sound. You know, the capture of Port Royal Sound was headed by Flag Officer Samuel Francis DuPont, and it actually was captured on November 7th, 1861. It is going to become, it's a huge anchorage, and so it becomes the headquarters, so to speak, for the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And actually, we have what is known as the Blockade Strategy Board, which is all called the DuPont Board. And as soon as Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln declared a blockade of the entire southern coastline. That's 3,600 miles of, and the U.S. Navy back then had beginning of the war, they had 93 ships. Half of them were obsolete, lost 14 of them at Gosport Navy Yard. And so you have a very difficult position to try and blockade these ports. And so Winfield Scott comes up with the concept that is known as the Anaconda Plan. And it's called Scott's Great Snake. And so basically it is showing that he wants to blockade the coastline all the way to the Mississippi, and thence at the Mississippi to conquer the Mississippi. That would strangle the eastern portion of the Confederacy, and the war would be end in a victory for the Union. It wasn't as simple as that, but I have to tell you, this is Samuel Francis DuPont. He is actually, his uncle is the famous DuPont. His family, his branch is not as wealthy. However, Samuel Francis DuPont is going to marry the daughter of his uncle, his first cousin, and so he gets the money anyway. So anyway, making a long story short, he is going to be named head of the Blockade Strategy Board, and he had been in the U.S. Navy since 1815. He's actually a pretty hero during the Mexican-American War, which he serves on the Pacific Coast, plays a huge role in the conquest of Upper California and then also Lower California. But we only annex Upper California. But anyway, so he's at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 1861, the beginning of it, as commandant. And so he will be selected to become the chair of the Blockade Strategy Board. On this board will also be Charles Henry Davis. Now, he's a commander at this time. He will later become a flag officer. I'm envious of his mustache, but he had been in the Navy for a significant time. Also on the board are two graduates of West Point, Major, later Brigadier General, John Gross Bernard, who graduated from West Point second in his class in 1833. Then also the man who's head of, now, Bernard is head of Chief Engineer of the Washington Defenses. The next person is Alexander Dallas Bosch, and he happens to be head of the U.S. Coast Survey. And so and he is a graduate of West Point, class of 1825, later gets a PhD. So here are these brilliant people coming up with how are we going to actually blockade the South. So in essence, the board decides that you have to cut the sections of the Confederate coastline into sections. So you will eventually have the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron that goes from Cape Charles all the way down to Wilmington. And then at the South Carolina border, You have the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron that goes all the way down to Key West. Once you get into the Gulf of Mexico, you have the East Gulf Blockading Squadron that stops around Pensacola. And then you have what is known as the West Gulf Coast Blockading Squadron. And each of them are going to have different type of headquarters because you have to have bases because the steamers are all powered by coal. So one of the big reasons to conquer Port Royal Sound is that you could use it as a base to support the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So it's very, very important. And the DuPont board organizes these fleets. Originally, you just had the Atlantic Blockading Squadron commanded by Silas Horton Davis, Silas Horton Stringham, excuse me, and he basically will conquer the first, or he has the first amphibious operation of the war, capturing Hatteras Inlet. However, he gets his feathers ruffled when they divide the blockading squadron, so he resigns. And so in his place for the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron will be Louis Machibres Goldsborough. Now, I have to say that the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, oh my gosh, is going to be commanded by Samuel Francis DuPont. He kind of picks himself to have this leadership role. Now, the Confederates, this man, of course, is the hero of Fort Sumter. He is Gustave Toutant Beauregard. And so, you know, he's a really powerful, I mean, he's a West Point graduate. He is also a very significant engineer. And so as a result of this, he will, you know, be selected by the governor of South Carolina to go and defend Port Royal Sound. Now, he writes back to the governor, hey, look, you know, this is not going to work very well because the mouth of the Port Royal Sound is so wide that you just can't make it work. It is actually 2.2 miles in width. So when you're on the different points, Hilton Head Island and Phillips Island, you can't cross your shot. So in other words, the range of the Confederate guns could not really close the harbor's entrance, especially if you stood in the middle of the harbor to entrance. So Beauregard draws up some of these plans, and the man that puts them into motion, you can see this is a coastal survey chart of the entrance to Port Royal Sound. This is the Beaufort River right there. So this is a you know, a very difficult place to enter. And of course, the Union immediately starts to build new style of what are called gunboats. They buy up every ship they can. They also will start a massive building program. There are 90 days they can build a ship, believe it or not. And so these are called 90-day gunboats. This is the Pocahontas that's going to be commanded by Percival Drayton. Now, I got to tell you, this is going to be the flagship of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. This is the Wabash, which is part of the Merrimack class of steam screw frigates. And so this is going to be DuPont's flagship. Now, basically, once we decide that we're going to attack, you know, the Confederates are building these forts. You saw the plans. We also know that they're going to General Gren, who's a West Point graduate, in 1828, he graduates with Jefferson Davis, you know, etc. He's from South Carolina. His family owned Drayton Hall. He actually marries into great wealth, and his wife owns a cotton plantation on Hilton Head Island, which these coastal islands known as the Sea Islands are going to be where you plant a certain finer type of cotton. So it's great wealth for these people. So the Confederates also have a little gunboat fleet commanded by Josiah Tatnall. And I got to tell you, Tatnall is a real hero. He's a hero during the War of 1812, during the Battle of Craney Island. He actually wades out into the mud flats out in front of Craney Island and captures the Admiral's barge, Admiral Warren's barge, known as the Centipede, because it had so many oars and it was painted lime green. And so he becomes famous from early on. Now, so when we plan the Port Royal Sound expedition, we are going to actually, Winfield Scott is going to pick Brigadier General Thomas Sherman, also a West Pointer, no relation to William Tecumseh Sherman, but he's going to pick him to lead the military component. And then Samuel DuPont is going to actually, head the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Now, what's going to transpire is basically that Sherman is going to organize his force up in Annapolis, Maryland. He's going to have a 13,000-man command, which divided into 3 brigades, commanded by Egbert Veal, Isaac Stevens, and Horatio Wright, all West Pointers. Now, his men are on 25 transports, believe it or not, and they'll come down to Hampton Roads to rendezvous with the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, also in Hampton Roads. If you were on Fort Monroe and looked out into Hampton Roads, it was filled with sailing ships, steamers, and what have you, because there are just alone 20 colliers that have to go with this campaign going down to South Carolina. So actually, it's a strike force of 77 ships in total. Now, they all rendezvous on 22 October 1861. However, a terrible storm comes through, and Winfield Scott will remind both DuPont and Sherman that Lincoln has said, the most cordial and effective cooperation will hold any commander. He expects every commander to have the most cordial and effective cooperation, and that the president personally will hold any commander of either branch to a strict responsibility for any failure to procure harmony and secure results proposed. There's a rivalry between the Army and the Navy. Everyone wants to take credit for this and that. Some generals don't work well with the Navy. Other generals, like Ulysses S. Grant, work very well with the Navy. So it's really a point of view that some people have. So bad weather comes to Hampton Roads, just like the gale we had last week, and the ships can't leave. Actually, the Army transports use all of their food, and then they discovered that the ammunition had been stored at the bottom of other type of supplies. So they have to go to General John Ellis Wool, commander of the Union Department of Virginia, headquartered at Fort Monroe. Said, I need ammo, I need food. We've eaten all of our cooked rations. So voila, we'll recognize that by October 28th, the storm clears. DuPont will first send all the colliers and the 2 gunboats known as the Vidalia, it's a sloop of war with 18 guns, and the 6-gun bark, the Gem of the Sea. And they don't go to Port Royal Sound. They go down to Savannah and anchor off the mouth of the Savannah River, which is an effort to try and fool the Confederates into thinking, they're going to attack Savannah. Well, the big problem is that even though DuPont has sealed orders to his captains of where the destination is going to be, actually the New York Times on October 26, 1861, is going to tell all about the expedition, naming ships, regiments, and other type of information, so that it appears in the New York Times they're going to Port Royal. The Confederates, Their newspapers in Charleston, like the Charleston Mercury, will publish, oh my gosh, the Federals are going to attack Port Royal Sound. So I have to say, they will leave Hampton Roads on November 1st, 1861, in beautiful, clear weather, kind of like yesterday. And sadly, though, when they pass Cape Hatteras, they will run into a gale, and this is called a hurricane force gale. And basically, they are in serious trouble. Many ships, like the Governor, all right, it was hit by the storm so badly that it broke its hog braces, these chains that kind of hold ships together, stop them from hogging, so to speak. And then it lost its smokestack, then it lost its engine, a cylinder head blows, and so they are wallowing in the sea with hurricane force winds, and a gunboat comes by, Isaac Smith. Now, it only survived the evening of the storm thanks to throwing overboard all their guns except for one. But they go and try to help the Governor. The seas are so rough, it will take the 44-gun sailing frigate, the Sabine, to come by, and actually they maneuver the Sabine so that they basically come next to the Governor, and they transfer all the men from the Governor onto the Sabine, and this is, you know, bravery of the highest order. They saved 700 men, losing 7. So that's amazing. Another transport carrying an entire regiment, the Winfield Scott, will blow a major leak, and it has 5 feet of water in its hull, and it was towed to safety by the Vanderbilt. The Mohican went to rescue the crew of the Peerless. Now, the Mohican is another 90-day gunboat. It is 10 guns, and they saved 26 crew members of the Peerless before it goes down with its entire cargo of horses. This is a fierce storm. In fact, no one knows what happens to these other transports known as the Belvedere, the Union, and the Osceola, all carrying supplies. They vanish without a trace. Oh my gosh. Now, the fleet starts to come together off of Port Royal Sound. They all have the sealed orders, so they know where to go. It takes several days to bring them all together. And in fact, on November 5th, 1861, the DuPont sends the Coast Survey vessel Vixen in to mark the channel into Port Royal Sound and where the ships can operate. They are protected by the 90-day gunboats, the Pembina, Seneca, and the Ottawa. Tatnall brings out, he's got 4 little gunboats, right, with 2 cannon each, and they're kind of like tugs, and so they get chased off. Tatnall makes a show of force, but then he retreats. So the next day, November 6th, which is very stormy, DuPont will send the Curlew Isaac Smith, the Pawnee, the Pembina, the Seneca, and the Ottawa in to test the ranging and the guns of Fort Beauregard, which is one of the forts, and Fort Walker. So they're defending the entrance to Port Royal Sound. They realize that these ships are way beyond the range of the Confederates. This is another 90-day gunboat that's going to be part of this invasion, the Unadilla. Where they come up with some of these names, I'm not sure. So basically, as they're waiting, once they test the range of the 2 forts, which you can see here, Fort Walker is on Hilton Head Island, and Fort Beauregard is on Phillips Island. And you can see how wide the entrance is. And so the plan, Charles Henry Davis goes to DuPont and says, look, you know, I was part of Stringham's capture of Hatteras, and we put our ships in elliptical circle, course, and so that the forts have to fire at moving targets, where we on board the ships get to use fire at fixed fortifications. So that means the Federals have an advantage. And so they come in, and it's amazing. DuPont then says, yes, that's great. He gets two columns put together. The main column features the Wabash, the side wheeler Susquehanna, which you saw a little earlier, 6-gun screw steamer Monacan, the 6-gun steamer Seminole, 10-gun steamer Pawnee, and 4-gun screw gunboat the Onondaga. Then they have starboard of the main column, right? You're going to have a force of gunboats, which is called a flanking squadron, and it will include the Benville, the Seneca, Curlew, Penguin, and actually also the Augusta. So anyway, they go into this circle, but all of a sudden, as they make this first turn, several boats break off because by being positioned here, they can actually play fire into Fort Walker. But DuPont, the Susquehanna, and several other ships continue on this course for 3 circuits, right? Well, I have to tell you, the Pocahontas will join the battle, and it's commanded by this man, Captain Percival Drayton. Oh my gosh, Drayton is the brother of Thomas Drayton, and he is anti-slavery, an abolitionist of sorts. He had actually joined the U.S. Navy when he was 14, and so Drayton is going to be, it's a kind of classic thing, a brother against brother. So as that break-off squadron, which is started by the Pembina, they will fire into Fort Walker in such a fashion that now this battle is going to start at 9:30. By 1 o'clock, the Fort Walker has only 3 cannons still operating, and so Drayton says, I'm going to go get some more men, and so we can fix the guns. And sadly, you can see the fierceness of the bombardment. This is Fort Walker, and you get a good view of how the Union cannonading is being so successful. So by 1 o'clock, you'll see, excuse me, that they abandon Fort Walker. By abandoning Fort Walker, that really pretty well ends the battle. They leave in such a rush that they leave all their baggage behind, they leave food behind, they leave all the guns. They're not spiked. So in other words, they rush out of there. Commander John Rogers notes that there's no Confederates in the fort. They're not firing back. And so he gets in a cutter and goes ashore and will raise the yes, this is another view of Fort Walker. Those are actually troops back there of the 1st South Carolina, in parentheses, African descent, close, regiment. And this is the 1st African-American regiment organized during the war. And we'll get to that story in just a little bit. There's Rogers putting up the American flag with a great huzzah. Everyone realizes that when Fort Brewery sees that Fort Walker has surrendered, then they abandon that fort. And so this is from the museum's collection. It's a beautiful sketch of the Union fleet after the battle. That's Fort Beauregard or Fort Walker, excuse me. And so you've got a good scene right there is the Wabash. So this is actually drawn by it's a Walsh drawing done by a soldier known as William Birch McMurtry, who actually works for the U.S. Coast Survey. And he's used to doing sketches like this because when the Coast Survey would survey a harbor, they actually would give a sketch of what it looked like coming in. So you had these landmarks and so forth. So with the capture of Fort Walker, what are we going to do? Because you have to realize that once they control Port Royal Sound, the Sea Islands along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, they all of a sudden, here are all the enslaved people. These are actually the former enslaved people owned by Thomas Drayton. And when the Union shows up, all the owners of the plantations on these Sea Islands, they all abandoned it. So all of a sudden, these African Americans now are basically spontaneously call themselves free. Because I want to remind you all that here in Hampton Roads, we actually at Fort Monroe, in May of 1861, we had the contraband of war decision done by Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler. And that meant any any African Americans, former enslaved persons that came into the Union lines, they would be classed as contraband. The Union didn't say they were free or what have you, but this prompted the African Americans who became contrabands all thought themselves to be free. And as a result of this, when you get to Port Royal Sound, that same situation is going to happen. Now in Hampton, Virginia, they set up what are called contraband camps. They actually, if you go on Hampton University campus, you've got a huge live oak right near the entrance onto Interstate, and that's where one of the first schools was created. That's a witness tree. And if you haven't been there, you should go because it's pretty awesome. So anyway, Solomon Chase, the Secretary of Treasury, the war is costing so much money that he wants to gather all the cotton. So he sends Colonel William Reynolds to Beaufort, North Carolina, and to commandeer all of the cotton that's there. The next question that arises, how are we going to motivate these newly freed individuals into planting another crop? And since Chase was a leading abolitionist, he turns to the American Missionary Association. Now you have to realize that here in Hampton, the American Missionary Association will actually set up schools. They help former enslaved people to learn to read and write, which is formerly against the law. They also train them for new skills. They gave them this a pathway to full citizenship once the war was over. So the Confiscation Act of August 1861 codifies this contraband of war decision. And so what's going to happen is that Chase will send Reverend Edward Lilly Pierce to go to Port Royal and to do a couple things to encourage those newly freed African Americans to continue cotton production with work supervision by trained members of the AMA. And they also they improved their living conditions, building better housing and so forth. These new freemen were paid for their work, and they set up schools, and this is a great school. It kind of looks like a Rosenwald school in some ways, but it's not. So when they build these schools, they are going to actually have a certain type of education. Now, they confiscate all the land that has been abandoned by the former members of the slaveocracy who fled to the interior of South Carolina. And as a result of that, the AMA will set up a process for ownership of land. And that land has been, so they taught them how to be landowners. They taught them how to read and write. They taught them skills beyond just cotton production. They taught them how to be owners of land. So that was fabulous work. It's called the Port Royal Experiment, and it is really modeled exactly after what happens at Fort Monroe, or Hampton, Virginia, a little earlier in the war. Now, all of a sudden, they are going to, this is another great view. That's where it really looks that part like a Rosenwald school. And so you can see the students out in front. And so they had a great yearning, according to Pierce, for learning. And as a result of that, these schools become very successful. Now, I have to tell you, this is the first South Carolina African descent regiment that is celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. This man is going to be in command of the Union Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. His name is David Hunter. He is a graduate of West Point, class of 1822. He's called Black Dave because of his coal black hair, and I don't know whether he used boot black to color his hair or what, but he's got a bad comb over in this picture. General Hunter is actually will serve in the Mexican War, the Seminole Wars, and is somewhat of a hero. He is shot in the neck at the first Battle of Bull Run, right around here, and so as a result of that, after he recovers from his wound, he then comes down to South Carolina to take command. Now, before the war, he was commander of the Department of Kansas. You all know about the Bleeding Kansas, the fight between making Kansas part of the slave states or making it a free state. So while he's there, he becomes an ardent abolitionist, and consequently, he will take those abolitionist views and bring them down to Port Royal. Now, when he takes command, he is going to issue a couple of orders, kind of like executive orders, right? Number 10 is saying everybody's free. Lincoln writes them, you can't free them, only I can. And so you got to stop that. And then he also issues order number 7. And that, I think, is the most important because he establishes, he recruits 500 African Americans, newly freed men, into the 1st South Carolina Regiment. Now, and most of these regiments, here's a photograph of it. They're going to call it later, they call these units United States Colored Troops, so USCT, but when it's first organized, it has this paren that says it is African descent. So this is very important when you think about what happens in Port Royal. Number 1, it becomes a major base so that they can capture several ports in Savannah. They blockade Savannah thanks to the capture of Fort Pulaski, Fernandina, Florida, and they're able to maintain a very close blockade of Charleston, all because they have that base at Port Royal Sound. Added to this, they are going to tell us what should be done with these newly freed people, how to try to treat them, how to try to teach them certain things about how to live their lives as newly freed people. You got to realize the enslaved population of the Sea Islands some of them date, their families would have dated back to the 1680s. And as a result of that, the Sea Islands and the Beaufort area, leading for cotton, leading also for rice cultivation. So after almost 200 years of enslavement, They now are free. They are taught about, as I said, land ownership. They're taught about how to read and write, how to get different skill sets to be self-sufficient citizens of the United States of America. So that's what makes this Port Royal Sound experiment, as they call it, so successful, so noteworthy, and everywhere the Union Army goes on the coast, the same events will happen. So what does the capture of Port Royal Sound mean? It is the first real step towards ensuring the ability of the blockade to stay on station, the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. They will soon, in the Gulf Coast, they will eventually capture Pensacola, Florida. Then they'll capture Ship's Island, which becomes the base for the West Gulf Coast Squadron. So, excuse me, these are very important efforts to strangle the Confederacy. And they needed those bases for coaling, for machine shops. I'll just tell you, I'm going to do a lecture sometime next year about the Montauk. Actually, it runs over a mine. It's commanded by John Lomer Worden. And it blows a big hole in the bottom of the mine. Worden runs it aground, so it gets mud patched. They put a patch in. They go to Port Royal Sound, and they will have their bottom rebuilt. And so that just shows you the extent of the machine shops they have at Port Royal Sound. So that's my story for today, the capture of Port Royal Sound. DuPont, it will be later, he's a flag officer when he captures it. As soon as they establish the admiral rank, the first person to receive the position of Rear Admiral will be David Glasgow Farragut, and the second will be Samuel Francis DuPont. And anyway, the capture of Port Royal Sound, often overlooked, is a critical and, number one, forging the Civil War into a war that's going to eradicate slavery. And also, it will be the basis for ensuring the defeat of the Confederacy by strangling the Confederacy from overseas supplies and also from sending out their cotton, etc. So thank you all for being with me today. There's another picture of Samuel Francis DuPont. Now I want to remind you all, you can email me with any questions that you might have. I have written a blog, which appears on the Mariners Museum website. For most of my lectures, I do write blogs, and so you can learn more about it. I only did a little bit about the Port Royal experiment, because that actually would require another 2 hours for me talking, and it's a fabulous story, which there's several books. You can look at my bibliography on my blog and see the books that you can reference to learn more about the Port Royal experiment. So, and you can also be sure to subscribe to our Zoom programs. I'm doing another one, when is it? Next Friday, right? About, it's about ballooning during the Civil War, which is a fabulous topic. So anyway, I want to thank you for being here today, and I'm ready to have any questions.
Okay, John, we have several here.
Okay.
I hate to answer that I'll have to research further for Ron. He grew up in Port Royal, and he says, is this photo in the town of Port Royal? Well, that's what I found when I found the image. It said it was Port Royal, and it came out of Dickinson College. So everything about that photo with the 1st South Carolina Regiment, the image was identified as that, but as to where I could tell you in that town, I don't know. So I'm sorry.
It's hard to really place that photograph because it tries to include the entire regiment.
Right.
And you can tell that that regiment is going to be at Fort Walker because there's a photograph of them in Fort Walker. Where their camps would have been, my thought would be on the land side of the Sound, so that they could, operate against the Confederate population of South Carolina, raiding for cotton, etc., as well as dealing with Confederate guerrillas and so forth. Some people said they should have reinforced Port Royal with a larger army because they could have captured by landside both Savannah and Charleston very easily in 1862. They could have also moved up the South Carolina post and captured Wilmington. So had they done that, done a different strategy, they would have more than likely ended the war in 1862. But they didn't think they didn't decide to do it. So anyway.
Okay.
Um,
Michael asked, where was gunboat CSS Huntress when the initial Union ships arrived on November 4th and 5th?
They're in Skull Creek, which if I go back to the map, I can show you exactly where Skull Creek is. And that's Tatnall operates in and out of it. When the Federals, capture the two forts, Tatnall takes his squadron and goes all the way down to Savannah, because you can, using the various sounds inside of the Sea Islands. So Skull Creek is going to be, I can't see it in this picture, so let's see if I can have it in another one. Yes, river, that's Skull Creek right there. So that's where they would have been based out of. And they are so poorly, how could I say, poorly staffed that there are really four major gunboats that is in the official records assigned to Tatnall's squadron. And that would be the CSS Savannah, the CSS Resolute, the CSS Lady Davis, and the CSS Sampson. The Huntress is down near Savannah during this engagement. So it actually isn't part of the small squadron that Tatnall has to face this huge Union fleet. So, I mean, they have 17 very powerful warships. Each one of these little tugs are armed with 2 guns, and so that makes them very, how could I say, they're unable to really block the Union. So anyway, that's my answer. And I think it's the volume 12. Pardon?
I had another question here.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Jerry asked, does Fort Walker still exist?
No, it doesn't. I've been to the site of Fort Beauregard, and nothing really remains from that either. They are not classic fixed fortifications. They're built out of sand, reinforced by sandbags. They are earthworks, and so those earthworks, especially in a place that is now very popular for tourists, they have been long gone. And so when I went down to Beaufort, I actually sailed right through the Sound and went out to sea from Port Royal Sound, and there's no forts to see from the water view anyway. And in Beaufort, they have one cannon in the town. Actually, they have preserved the home of Robert Smalls, who's another story for another time. But he later becomes a congressman, African-American congressman, after the war, during Reconstruction. Okay?
Alan had trouble signing in, but I know you'll answer this since he missed it. Is Admiral DuPont related to the Wilmington, Delaware DuPonts?
He was born in Delaware. His father has a mill on the Delaware River, right near where the really rich DuPonts of Winterthur have their gunpowder mills. And as a result of that, I would have to say that it is, he is well, he marries his first cousin, who's part of the real wealthy ones. His father, Mill, goes bankrupt, and that's why Samuel Francis DuPont doesn't go to college. Instead, he goes in, so that's his story, and he marries into the wealthier DuPonts, who actually spell their names slightly differently than the Samuel Francis DuPont line. So yes, they're related. They come over from France and make a large amount of money. Okay.
Yes, they do.
Still do today.
You talked about the Sea Island cotton, John, but Barry's shared something really interesting here, that Beaufort, at the beginning of the Civil War, was one of, if not the wealthiest city in the U.S. because of Sea Island cotton. There was a huge slave population because the Sea Island cotton could not be ginned, because ginning would destroy the fine fiber.
And you know why it didn't have to be? Also, didn't have to be ginned because it didn't have seeds in the bowl, right? That makes it a short staple cotton versus long staple. I think I got that right. Long staple cotton is Sea Island cotton. Short staple is what you see in the fields if you drive out to Southampton County and other places on the south side of the James. So they have seeds in the bowl, and that's why you have to invent the cotton gin, which is a fabulous story. It's invented on Mulberry Hill Plantation by Nathaniel Green's wife, because Nathaniel Green dies after the Revolutionary War from a heart attack. His wife will inherit this plantation. She laments to the schoolmaster who is teaching her children that, oh my gosh, we're going to go bankrupt because it takes so much labor to move these seeds. Well, the guy who's the schoolmaster was Eli Whitney, and we know what he did. He invented the cotton gin. So you're very right that both Beaufort is one of the wealthiest communities, not only from cotton, Sea Island cotton as they call it, but also because of rice cultivation. Rice cultivation is really huge. It's brought by those Africans who some of the first African descended people that arrive in America. So it is the South Carolina coast and the Georgian coast make people very wealthy because of indigo, because of rice, and because of Sea Island cotton. So you're very right, Jerry. Okay, next question.
Well, Michael just shares, and I know you agree too, John, that the DuPont gunpowder mill, mansion, and gardens in the Brandywine River area are well worth visiting.
Oh yeah,
I agree with that. One of my favorite places.
And they also have the Hagley Museum, which is a mill, which is fabulous. There's actually a restaurant at one mill on the Wilmington River that I've been to. I've been to Winterthur. They actually have a tremendous program for training people in curatorial services, and the collection is fabulous. The architecture is mind-blowing. And I know one of the direct descendants of that branch of the DuPont, William DuPont. I think he's still alive, but he's a big decoy collector. So somehow I got to know him. And William DuPont lives in Newark, Delaware, on Pheasant Hill Road. And that's a nice place. What can I say?
It is lovely area. And I have to ask, where did they keep the horses on that ship
Oh, well, it's easy. You transport the ship, the horses. You put them in a sling. You take them from the dock and put them into the hole of the ship where they had built stalls. So
So they couldn't get out.
they could not get out. And so I guess if you ever find that shipwreck, the Peerless, you'll find you know, a lot of horses. Oftentimes, when ships get wrecked in storms, the horses are released, and that's why you have the horses on Chincoteague, Shackleford Bank, and so forth, up and down the coast. Those are descended from Spanish. Yeah.
I was
So
just
that's
hoping they got out.
I don't. There's no record that they did.
Right.
Once again, volumes 12 of the official records of the navies. I think it's around page like 260, between 310. All talks about the wrecks and the operation at Port Royal Sound. So it's not a fabulous read, but it's kind of the truth according to these people involved. So I'm looking at my set right now, and so.
Well, I think you did mention next Friday you'll talk about ballooning in the Civil War. So for aerial enthusiasts, please join us again next Friday, and then the Friday after that, John will talk about Admiral Farragut.
Yes.
So we have great new programs coming, and we thank you for being with us today. I think we got your questions, but if not, as John said, please email him and he'll be happy to answer. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all very much. You take care. Bye-bye.